The US military has registered another failure. No, they've not lost another war. It's about their latest hypersonic missile test. It was a dud. The test took place on the 13th of March. The US Air Force was testing what's called the ARRW, the Air Launched Rapid Response Weapon. It's a hypersonic missile made by Lockheed Martin. After the test, the Air Force released a statement, and this is what the statement said. The test met several of the objectives, and the team engineers and testers are collecting data for further analysis. Sounds promising, right? This was on the 24th of March, the statement came. But it turns out the Americans left out some details. Details like the fact that the test had failed. This is what reports say. The weapon failed to transmit in-flight performance data. Now, this data is crucial to understanding how the weapon flies. And if this data is missing, then the test is basically a failure. And it's another setback for America in the hypersonic missile race, especially for the ARRW project. Because this is not the first failure. Lockheed's missiles have failed before, at least thrice. They suffered booster test failures. And production keeps getting delayed because of this. The US had initially planned to deploy the ARRW this year, but it seems unlikely. Of course, this is not the only US hypersonic missile program. They have others for the US Navy and the Army too, and the Air Force too has another program, a hypersonic missile being produced by Raytheon. But this failure is still important. You see, the US is struggling to catch up with Russia and China. Both are said to be far ahead in terms of hypersonic weapons. Russia even used some against Ukraine recently. And before we continue, let's also understand what these weapons really are. A hypersonic missile is one that can travel 5 times at the speed of sound or faster. If a weapon is faster than the speed of sound, but not hypersonic, it's called a supersonic weapon. Now, hypersonic missiles are fast. They're also maneuverable, meaning you can control their trajectory. And that's why these weapons are part of the new arms race. They can beat missile defense systems. Let's go back a bit in history to understand this. In the 20th century, the major world powers were building nuclear weapons, and this race was especially close between the US and the Soviet Union. So obviously, countries had to build systems to counter the nukes. They developed advanced air defense systems, like the American Patriot missiles or the Russian S-400s. The US in particular boasts of extremely efficient air defense networks. Its adversaries then started building something to counter this. Enter hypersonic missiles. They can evade Patriots and other air defenses. They can carry nuclear warheads. Soon a hypersonic arms race began. It's still a very small club. India is developing hypersonic weapons. So are Japan, Germany, Israel, Iran, and North Korea. These weapons are extremely expensive. Each missile costs anywhere between $15 to $18 million. So this cannot really be the future of war. A war, especially a long-drawn one, will rely on conventional weapons, the kind that are cheap and easy to use. Like we're seeing in Ukraine, Kiev keeps asking for artillery rounds, for tanks and jets. These are weapons that have been around forever. They're reliable and old-fashioned. Hypersonic missiles serve a very different purpose. Deterrence. It's like having nuclear weapons. They deter the enemy. They reduce the risk of an attack. So America's failure to catch up with China and Russia may not be the worst thing, really. But the US, being the US, is not satisfied. They want to make sure that American military superiority is never in doubt. Now, the war in Ukraine has been on for more than a year. Every once in a while, the West imposes more sanctions on Russia. The economy is holding up, though, despite the setbacks. So how is Russia managing? Has life become very difficult for its citizens? Far from it. From computer chips to smartphones and furniture, from branded clothes to toys, Russians have access to all of it. And that's because President Vladimir Putin has been able to figure a way around Western sanctions. Russia has backdoor deals with several countries, and they're helping Moscow a lot, especially with semiconductors. So which countries are these? And what is the West doing about it? Here's a report.
Russian President Vladimir Putin proudly says that the West's luxuries are still available in Russia. That's a damning indictment of Western sanctions and how they have failed to deliver. But something he doesn't flaunt as regularly is the continuing flow of semiconductors to Russia. And that's because this flow is facilitated by a complex network of shell companies and backdoor deals. This network was not built overnight. It's been in the works for years now, much before Russia invaded Ukraine. So Putin has been preparing. Several countries are involved in this secret supply ring, and all of them are close to Russia. Turkey, Kazakhstan, Belarus, China, and the UAE are key players facilitating the supply of microchips to Russia. Each country plays some role in American semiconductors reaching Russia. Chinese companies, for example, are believed to be the intermediaries. Companies in the UAE are said to be financing these transactions. Essentially, shell companies in Turkey, the UAE, and China have been buying semiconductors from the US and then reselling these to Russia. Let's talk about just one American chip manufacturer, Intel. Between April and October last year, Intel products worth more than $457 million arrived in Russia. Intel is one of the many Western companies that withdrew from Russia after the war began. Also last year, the UAE's export of semiconductors to Russia increased 15 times compared to 2021. Kazakhstan is a key transit hub for such goods. Its customs are overloaded. Last year, Kazakhstan exported semiconductors worth $3.7 million to Russia. That's almost 300 times higher than what it exported to Russia before the war began. Russia remains Kazakhstan's biggest trading partner. Kazakh exports to Russia increased 25% in 2022 to $8.8 billion. That brings us to the bigger picture of certain countries helping Russia not just get its hands on semiconductors, but a variety of products. Here too, countries like China, Turkey, Armenia, and Belarus are playing an instrumental role. Russian companies are still getting hold of machine parts, furniture from IKEA, toys from the United States, and luxury items from big brands like Giorgio Armani and YSL. Ideally, sanctions should have ensured that Russians don't get any such items. But here's one example of how sanctions are failing in their foremost goal. Pochta Global is a Hong Kong-based company that has ties with Russia's National Postal Service. This company is helping Russians order items from the likes of Nike, Zara, and H&M. Another example, Apple products are still circulating in Russia. There are websites where Russians can place orders for iPhones and get them delivered to their doorstep in 2 hours. None of this is hidden from the West. The US has already drawn a red line for countries helping Russia. In February, Antony Blinken visited Kazakhstan and said, "We are watching compliance with sanctions very closely, and we're having an ongoing discussion with a number of countries, including our C5 partners, on the economic spillover effects." He also said that the violation of sanctions cannot be allowed.
If we allow them to be violated with impunity, then that does open the prospect that Russia itself will consider further aggression against other countries if it sets its sight on them, or other countries will learn the wrong lesson, and would-be aggressors in every part of the world will say, well, if Russia can get away with this, then we can too.
That has prompted at least Kazakhstan to say that it will tighten its export rules. Whether that translates into Russia actually feeling the pinch remains to be seen. And as you know, Kazakhstan is not the only country helping Russia. There's a network of countries that seem to have Russia's back. To get all of them to comply with sanctions will be a mammoth task for Washington. Putin's backdoor network may be shady and borderline illegal, but it's making sure that Russia gets what it needs.
In West Asia, though, the picture looks very different. Business is booming there. There's a gold rush of a new kind. New unicorns are rising. There is an IPO boom in West Asia. What's an IPO? Initial public offering. It's the first time a company offers shares to the public. So initial offering. It's a way to raise funds in exchange for shares. Now, IPOs in West Asia are at a record high, and they're raising big money from investors. Why is this significant? Because West Asia is bucking the global trend. Around the world, there's a slowdown. The markets are bearish. But that's not the case in West Asia. I have some numbers. Last year, 51 companies went public. This was a record in itself. But do you know how much money they raised? $22 billion. That's an increase of 179% from the previous year. More companies are going public this year. Recently, a company called Presight AI listed itself in Abu Dhabi. Its IPO was worth $496 million. The issue was oversubscribed, 136 times, meaning there were more applications from share buyers than the number of shares available. The demand was higher than the supply of shares. That's oversubscription. Before Presight, a company called ADNOC Gas listed itself in Abu Dhabi. This is Abu Dhabi's national oil company, ADNOC. It is the state-owned energy giant of the UAE. Do you know how much money they raised? $2.5 billion. ADNOC Gas is now Abu Dhabi's largest listed company, and you see the trend. This wave of new IPOs is likely to continue. It was kick-started by Saudi Arabia with the $29 billion listing of Aramco. Aramco, as you would know, is Saudi Arabia's state-owned oil company. It went public in December 2019. Aramco is also the world's largest oil producer and the world's most profitable company. It's hard to match that scale. There are only a few companies like Aramco in the world. The rest are simply happy to ride this wave. And the conditions are right. There's a lot that's working in West Asia's favor. The most obvious factor is the high energy prices. Plus, inflation is much lower than the West. And structural reforms are picking pace. The oil-rich Gulf states are well positioned. They have a massive corpus of funds and they're ready to spend this money. When I say a massive corpus, how much money am I talking about? Nearly $4 trillion. That's the corpus of the region's 10 sovereign wealth funds, $4 trillion. This is bigger than the GDP of Western countries like France and the United Kingdom. And they want to spend this money. These funds have already deployed billions of dollars. Last year, more than $73 billion was invested. And who pumped in this cash? West Asia's top 5 sovereign funds. They're making bets beyond oil. They're investing in a range of sectors like renewables, climate technology, biotech, agri-tech, and digital transformation. So while the West fumbles, West Asia is upping its game. The developed economies are struggling. The war in Ukraine has put pressure on growth. Bank failures in America have made investors jittery. Europe is feeling the impact, but West Asian powers are projecting stability. They are the outliers. And key players appear ready to make big moves, like Saudi Arabia. For decades, it has used the dollar to sell oil. But now Riyadh could be considering decoupling from the dollar. Saudi Arabia is willing to do business in other currencies, like China's yuan, perhaps even the Indian rupee. Riyadh is said to have discussed this idea with New Delhi. The feasibility of a rupee-rial trade mechanism was discussed last year. Recently, Saudi Arabia also signed a deal with Kenya. Reports say Kenya will pay for Saudi oil in Kenyan shillings. Still early days, but the trend is promising. New economic powers are emerging, and West Asia is certainly among them. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Starting with France, where protests against the pension reform bill continues. There was chaos on the streets of Paris. Violent clashes broke out between the police and the protesters. Meanwhile, a damaged Russian spacecraft landed back on Earth. It had been docked at the International Space Station. It was apparently damaged by a meteorite. Wildfires are burning forests in Italy. Winds and dry weather conditions are making the situation worse. Spain is facing a similar situation. We'll show you satellite images released by NASA. And finally, what happened today in history? American forces withdrew from Vietnam. The year was 1973. Richard Nixon was the president of the U.S. The U.S., North Vietnam, and South Vietnam had recently signed a peace accord. One of the objectives was to ensure a quote-unquote honorable departure of the Americans. But the deal fell apart. That's a different story. On March 29th, the world saw the end of America's direct military involvement in the Vietnam War. We're leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.